Today we're going to be speaking about the basics of the kashrus of meat. So, from a kashrus perspective, preparing kosher meat is the most intense and the most sensitive of all foods. You need specially trained people to be Shechitah and Practicum and Nikkur, and then with that a whole team of mashgichim, full-time mashgichim all the time. And the stakes couldn't be any higher because any mistake or anyone who's being a little underhanded can lead to people being over an issa deraisa, something that you almost never have in any other food, that you could come to such serious violations and that it's so easy to go wrong. So today and the next two times that are part of this mini series, I'm going to talk about the basics of what's going on. We had a whole year worth of shiurim on it, but this is going to be just the basics of what things are, and let's go from here. Okay, now the first thing to think about is Shechitah, and that is in order to do Shechitah, you need to have a shechit who has enough knowledge and skill to do what he has to do, but sort of close to as important is that he should have yiras shamayim. And the reason why he has to have yiras shamayim, he has to be someone who we can really trust to do the right thing, is because a shechit makes decisions about things, and a baidik to a certain extent also, he makes decisions that are issues that are very subtle, and they're very on the spot, no thinking, and nobody else can check up on him. So it's completely up to him, and it's a quick yes or no decision on which is hanging very serious issue. Either it's a issa deraisa or it's 100% mutter based on his decision that he makes over there. So we need someone who's a yiras shamayim, on top of the fact that he has to know what he's doing, book knowledge and actual skill. Okay, now the basic act of Shechitah is you have to cut the Simanim. Those are two things on the neck. One is the kana, the trachea, and the other one is the veshet, the esophagus. And you have to cut them with a sharp knife. And the Gemara says that there are 5 hilchos Shechitah, 5 basic halachas of Shechitah. And I'm going to go through each one of them and just give each one a little example of each one of them. Okay, the first one is called Shechitah, which is the Shechitah has to go in one motion, and there shouldn't be any pauses. A Shechitah means a pause. There shouldn't be any breaks in the middle of the Shechitah. Should keep just the cutting should be in one continuous motion. Now, Ashkenazim are particularly machmir about this, and they don't even like even the smallest amount of pause. Even the smallest amount of a pause, a small Shechitah in the middle of a Shechitah will make the Shechitah possible. Not only that, but because of the problem, because Shechitah makes a Shechitah puzzle, therefore there are sometimes they can't even do a cut to the animal's neck after the Shechitah is over, while the animal is still being mefarches, meaning the actual Shechitah is over, the cutting is over, but the animal hasn't yet 100% died, and it's still thrashing around, and because at the wrong way, if done incorrectly, we would view that as a second cut, in which case there was a big break between the first one and the second one. There could be 30 seconds between the first and the second, and that would be a shehiyah. That's how far we take it to be concerned that something is a shehiyah, that even though the second cut was, no one was trying to do shechitah at that point anyhow, it could still might be viewed as a shehiyah. Okay, the second psul of shechitah is drasa, and that is that when the shechitah has to be through slicing rather than by cutting or pressing or chopping. Okay, so the shechitah has to be a slice through the neck. And one part of making sure we don't have a drasa is that the animal has to be secure. The head and the neck have to be secure during the shechitah, and one of the ways to do that is by putting the animal into a pen, which holds the animal still. This way, the animal's head doesn't slam against the knife in a way that would that might turn it into a drasa. If the animal would bang his head into the knife, then that's what's doing the cutting instead of the knife slicing. Also, there's another din that maybe most people are not so familiar with, which is that a shechit is not supposed to put his fingers on the blade, because if he does, that might lead him towards pushing down and causing a drasa, which would be possible to make the animal into a neveil. Okay, the third of the hilchos shechitah is chavada, which is that the knife can't be covered during shechitah, and because of that, that's one of to avoid a chavada is one of the reasons why on a sheep they shave the wool on the sheep's neck before shechitah. There are other ways to do it also, but they do that. One of the reasons to shave the neck is to avoid the wool draping over the chalep, over the knife, and causing a halal. Okay, the third of the Nikkur Shechitah is called Hagrama, and that is that the Simanim, the parts that have to be cut in the right place. They can't be cut too close to the head, or for that matter, too close to the body either, but that part is usually not the issue. But most problems of Hagrama is when the animal's cut too high, too close up to the head, in a way that makes it not kosher. That's not considered. That's no longer the siman. That's considered the neck. That's called the mouth, and that's not kosher. This tends to be more of an issue with poultry than with cattle, because in a bird, the whole area we could shech is that much smaller. So it's more common that the hagrama would happen in a bird, but it could happen in cattle also, for that matter. Okay, and the last of the Shechitah is Nikkur, which is the Simanim have to be cut. The Simanim have to be cut by the knife, which is rather than ripped out of the neck or dislodged. When it's dislodged, the type of Nikkur is when it's dislodged is called a Shechitah, but the Simanim have to be cut by the knife rather than being ripped out of the neck by the knife or something else or dislodged. So a knife that has begimas, certain nicks in the sharpness of the blade, could lead to an Nikkur. And that's the reason why we make sure there's no begimas in a knife, because if there's a nick, then what's going to happen is that place where there's like this indentation in the knife could catch on the siman, on the kana or the veshet and rip it out rather than slice it. That's where lots of effort goes into making sure the knives are sharp, sharpening the knives and checking them. They have to be checked for begimas before and after every shechitah. And if the knife is found to have a begima after the shechitah, then assuming the begima is bad enough, the animal that was shechted will be considered treif. Okay, now it takes lots of course, I mentioned skill, but it takes a lot of concentration and a lot of focus for a shechit to do his job properly. And Lamaisa, most of the shechtim, by and large, when you go around, the Gemara says, "Roi mitzuyin et shechita amumchanei," and in fact, nowadays you go around, you see the shechtim. By and large, the shechtim are very capable. Okay, but there are things that have to be done to give the shechit the ability to do his job properly, and an important part of that is that the shechit has to be given enough time. Meaning that the line, the speed of how fast the animals or the birds come has to be at a pace that's reasonable for him to do all the parts of his job. To check his chalaf and sharpen it if need be, check the animal after shechitah, check the chalaf after shechitah. He needs the amount of time to do his job properly. And that's really the Rav Machshir's, the Hashgachah's job, to keep an eye on it and make sure that the line goes at a speed that's reasonable and comfortable. For the shechit to do his job properly. For that matter, it's the Rav Machshir's job to make sure that the shechit gets breaks also, so that he can properly focus during the time he's supposed to be working. Okay, now it happens, not very common, but it happens that something goes wrong with the shechitah, and the animal is an avela, meaning it didn't have a proper shechitah. It was killed, but it didn't have a proper shechitah based on one of the problems. Let's say he finds a begima, or it was a hagrama, or I don't know, any of the. He realized in the middle it was a drasa. The animal moved his head in the middle and banged against the knife, or any of them. He paused in the middle for some reason. So if something that makes the animal into an avela, then the shechit or someone next to him has to mark it. And they need a procedure. How do they make sure that animal doesn't get sold as kosher? Because after it went for the shechitah, it goes through all the other steps that we're going to talk about. It goes through all the different steps, and eventually heads its way towards kosher meat. This would have shechitah to it. So different ways to use it. It usually has a cut in the leg. There's different ways to make sure to make sure that this animal is marked. This animal and all the parts of it are marked as being from an avail that it's not kosher. Okay, so now we move on from shechitah. The next major issue that there is to deal with an animal is Teraifos, and that is that if there's certain things that are wrong with an animal, a health issue or a defect, it makes the animal into a treifa, and the animal's not kosher. So there's lots of different ways the animal can become a treifa, but we say that a person is only mechuyev to check for the ways that are either very common, reasonably common, or somewhat common, or that are very easy to check for. Okay, so in most cases, the only parts of the animal that are checked are the lungs. And that whole idea of checking lungs to find out if an animal is a treifa there's very different ideas. The different ideas of how that's done, and it leads to all different kinds of standards of how kosher meat is. And what I think is kosher, the next person does not think is kosher. The next person wants to make it more kosher. All different rules, all different standards, many of which revolve around this question of how you check the lungs. In Mirza Hashem, we're going to talk about that next time. That's not for this time. How that happens and what makes this thing called Beis Yosef and Glad and not Glad. All that in Mirza Hashem has to do with lungs. And Mirza Hashem will talk about that the next time. Now, aside from checking the lungs, which you always have to do in an animal, it's common that they give a quick check of the stomach. The stomachs are taken out of the animal's body right near where the boidig is standing, where the person who's checking the lungs is. And he give a quick look to make sure there's no signs of treifa. He might touch it also to make sure there's nothing inside. It's not very common for there to be treifas over there, but since it's easy to check it and it's right there in front of him, so the Raja says it's near kamal ma'ayim isra. If you don't look for it, it's as if you don't care. So that's why we check it. Now there are some countries in South America where they do a surgical procedure to animals when they're alive, which affects the carus, which is the first stomach of the animal. And over there, it's standard that they check them. Every carus has to be checked to make sure the animal's not trefa. And sometimes dairy cows have an issue with their keva, which is their fourth stomach. And not so common that a dairy cow comes for shechitah, but if it does, then the buddy should just be aware and he could keep an eye out for that also. Now, in earlier generations, no one ever checked it poultry for treifas. The Rambam says a person would check a bird for treifas because it's so rare that they should have them. But nowadays it's not like that. There are things that have to be checked. And Mirza Hashem, we're going to talk about that in 2 times from now when we talk about Tasha's issues that have to do with birds and poultry, meat-related issues that have to do with that. Okay, so we're now moving on from treifas, excuse me, to Nikkur. And Nikkur is that there are 4 groups of items that are in the kosher animal. The animal had kosher shechitah and it had no treifas to it. So the animal's kosher, everything's wonderful, but there are 4 groups of things which are not allowed to be eaten. And they are blood, chalev, that means certain fats in the animal that are not allowed to be eaten, the gid hanasha, that's the sciatic nerve and certain things that are around it, towards the back of the animal. And there's some things that are considered mius, they're considered repulsive, that the minhag is we don't eat those things as well. Okay, so those 4, again, blood and chalev and gid hanasha and things that are mius. Most people know that when you do Melichah, you salt it, you get the blood out. Okay, and we're going to get to Melichah in a second. But before the Melichah happens, there are some steps have to happen to help with these 4 issues, these 4 things that you're not allowed to eat, or things that we do before the Melichah, and these are all, we sort of call them together call them Nikkur. Well, the first is that right after, excuse me, once the animal has been declared that it is not a treifa, then the animal gets cut in half. And the half means like from the navel to the spine, across. I call it, when the animal's hanging, it's across. If the animal would be standing up, it would be from top to bottom or bottom to top. It's between the 12th and the 13th rib. And what happens is the rear half of the animal, which we call the hindquarters, which is the back legs and that whole back side from the middle of the animal towards the back, is sold as not kosher. Okay. Now there's a question: is it an actual minhag in America to not use the hindquarters because of the reason I'm going to tell you in a second? Is that a minhag, or is it just not practical and therefore it's just a decision to not? It's not worth it. The effort and the concerns, it's not worth it to do it. The CRC's position is l'hachmir, that we consider that it's a minhag to not use them. Anyhow, that we can't use it even if we wanted to. So why is it? Why is the hindquarters sold as given to the non-kosher side? The reason is because the gid hanasha is in the hindquarters, and all of the chalev, and almost all the chalev that's asur midaraisa, not all, but almost all the chalev that's asur midaraisa is in the hindquarters. So by selling the hindquarters as not kosher, we avoid these very serious issues. We don't have to deal with the gid hanasha, which is the raisa. We don't have to deal with the chalev, which is by and large is in the back half of the animal. Okay. So now that whole half of the animal with the most serious issues has been sort of taken out of circulation, marked as not kosher. Now the so to speak real Nikkur gets started on the forequarters. Okay, now it happens to be the liver and the tail and the intestines technically part of the hindquarters, if you had to think about it, where they fit in the animal. But they are sold for kosher, and we'll see in a second there is some nikkur to them also. But when you say forequarters, that's the bulk of the animals in the forequarters. Okay, so in the forequarters we have to do the following: got to take out certain fats or items that are attached to fats. They're called yonik memachilot, and those come out from the liver and the ribs, the plate, the skirts, and the tail. Okay, you have to take out certain things like that. Then there's blood vessels that have to be taken out from the cheek and the tongue, and then some that goes from the neck, chuck, and the brisket, and the shoulder and the forearms. And why do we take the blood out? We do this before Melichah. We take that out because the blood in those places, it's thicker, bigger blood vessels, and the blood in there will not come out during Melichah. Okay, and so therefore we have to get it out before Melichah. And last is these glands that are taken out from the decal, that's a part of the brisket, in the front of the animal, the front lower down part of the animal, and from the hooves, those are considered miyas. There's a miyas in each one of those places. We have to take them out. Okay, so in the that's the nikkur. All these parts that have to be taken out, the fats and the blood vessels and the glands that are taken out, is what we would call nikkur. Now, there's lots of different minhagim as to what you have to and what you don't have to take out. The Gemara gives very simple ideas of what has to be taken out, very minimal ideas, if I can use that word, of things that have to be taken out. But there's all kinds of minhagim, and there are particularly big differences between how they do it in America and Eretz Yisrael, and between Ashkenaz and Sephardim. In just about every one of those cases, these differences are just related to chumras. It's like nothing or almost nothing that anyone thinks is Nikkur hadin is mechuyev to be taken out. But there are meaningful differences between how Nikkur is done in different places. Now, there's two big things that happened in the recent, we'll say, decades, as Melichah and Nikkur became more commercialized. Which is to say, it used to be that all the Melichah and Nikkur were done in the local butcher. And the Shechitah happened someplace, but the Nikkur and the Melichah happened at your local butcher. And now it's not really like that. There's not so many butchers who are doing Nikkur and Melichah, and almost all of it is done at the slaughterhouse itself. So the first change that happened because of it is that the minhagim that used to be very specific to different communities, like each community had the way they did it, and the local rav oversaw the local butcher shop to make sure they did it their way, the way their community's minhag was. Basically, they all got sort of melded together and amalgamated into one big process that Rabbi Machshir decided that's the best way, or that's the way that's our way, or that's the way that fits with the most people. So there's less and less of each kehillah doing it their own way. There are still some kehillas that their shechitah does it their way, but sort of things have become very homogenized rather than being different the way it used to be in each community. And the second is that in factories, they find it more efficient to do a lot of the nikkur right after the shechitah. It's called nikkur cham from the word hot, which is to say the animal is not yet chilled from refrigeration, which is when nikkur used to happen. The animal had shechitah, and by the time you came to the nikkur, the animal was chilled down. It was cold and refrigerated for days or at least overnight. But right now it's become considered more efficient to do big portions of the nikkur while the animal is still cham, is still warm. And there are people who are not so happy with that. There are people who are concerned that doesn't do as good of a job as it did the way they used to do. Okay, now the nikkur is very intricate and painstaking work. Very fine. You have to get specific things out, and you need a lot of. You have to know what you're doing, like a skill, but you also have to have attention to detail, like be able to focus on doing things correctly. And in most places, that work is actually done by people who are not Jewish. But what happens is there'll be a Shomer Shabbos Menaker who sits at the end of the line, and he checks every single piece as it comes by to make sure that it was done correctly. Okay, so now that we've done our nikkur, so if the shechitah, make sure the animal is not in the veil, the animal is kosher. Then we had bedika for treifas to make sure the animal's not a treifa. So now we have a kosher animal. Everything's kosher is good. Now we have to get out, as I mentioned, the nikkur to get out these four groups of things that have to get taken out of. And the last thing we need to do is melichah. And that's because there's still blood left in the animal. We just take out the larger blood vessels, but there's still blood in the animal. So we do a salting process. And the salting process itself has 4 steps to it. First is the meat has to have shriya, has to soak in the water for half an hour. Then we cover it all sides with coarse salt, otherwise known as kosher salt, because it's used for kashering. We put the meat into some kind of a container that has holes in the bottom of it so that the blood can drip out. and it stays in that container in that place for 60 minutes. And then last is we do the gimel hadachas. We rinse it 3 times in water to get salt and the blood off of it. Okay, now this whole procedure, this 4 steps, this procedure has to happen within 72 hours of Shechitah. And if for some reason you can't get it done within 72 hours, then before the 72 hours runs out, you can soak it in water, and that gives you another 72 hours to start the Melichah. Okay, now nowadays, not too many. It's not common at all that this is done as a lechatchila. Meaning, there was a time when this was like a regular part of making kosher meat. Is that the Shechitah would happen on a certain day. Let's say the Shechitah happened on Sunday, and then on Tuesday it still wasn't ready for Melichah because it was being shipped from here to there. That was far away, and it was a lechatchila. They always planned. And on Tuesday they would wash it or soak it with water to get them another 3 days, and then they would do the Melichah, let's say on Wednesday or Thursday. But nowadays it's almost not too many people do it as a lechatchila. There are some, but not too many people do it as a lechatchila. Usually it only happens when there's some kind of a delay, something unexpected happens that makes it that you couldn't get the Melichah done in time. I don't know, there's a snowstorm and the truck couldn't make it in time, and then they'll do this soaking or washing to extend the time. Okay, now a couple of details about these steps, these 4 steps I mentioned. The first step, which is the shriya, the soaking for half an hour, has to happen after the last time the meat is cut. Meaning, if you cut the meat again after the shriya, you have to do shriya again. So, therefore, there are those people who say that the people can't move the meat around, the employees can't move the meat around with hooks, which is what they often would do, they would want to do. They sort of grab the meat with a hook, because that's considered to be as if it's a cut. So once the shriya happens, there are those who say you should not use hooks in the meat, in the shechitah. Okay. Next is that the first step, the shriya, and the melichah, the shriya has to take 30 minutes, and the melichah has to take 60 minutes. So in most places, that timing is automated, which is to say is the meat is on a belt or on a chain or something like that, where it takes 30 minutes or 60 minutes to get from point A to point B. So you know that the meat sat in the water for long enough, or the meat was covered with salt for long enough, in order to have it 30 minutes or 60 minutes, depending on which stage it has. Other people's are more, people do it manually. They just, they put a marker, they'll put a piece of paper that says 10:37, which means that at 10:37, this one's going to be finished, whatever process it's in. But in lots of places, it's automated, meaning it takes a certain amount of time to get from here to there, and that way you know it had the right amount. Okay, now, the first step, which is the shriya, is often done in a water bath, not in a pool, in a bath, like in a long water bath, where the meat goes slowly through from here to there. But other places don't do it, they just put it into a container. And using a container is more common when you're using small parts like tails or cheeks or something like that, where there's not so easy to get them to pass through from one side of a bath to the other. They don't do well on belts or hooks or things like that. So they'll put them just into a container. And when I said beforehand that the Melichah has to be done on something that has holes in the bottom of it. So some people do that in a belt, or a belt that has holes in it. Some people put it into a container. They call it a combo, just like a big container with holes in the bottom of it. Or some people have it hanging from an overhead belt, like some kind of a belt that's overhead, so there's nothing underneath it, just drips on. Okay, so the point of any of these ways of doing it is that we want the blood that comes out of the meat just to drip, not to sit there, that the meat shouldn't sit in the blood. It should drip onto the floor or into someplace, drip away from where the meat is. So in the first 2 ways of doing it, like if it's on a belt or it's in a combo, so as I mentioned, there's going to be holes on the bottom, but also you want to put the meat, I don't know how to say this, you said put the meat facing down, which is say you make it that there's no puddles or places where the blood could collect in the meat. You think like a side of ribs, if you lay them the wrong way, then they'll be just like a place where the blood could collect in it. So you want to avoid that, and you put it facing down, so any blood that comes out drips down and then goes to the holes that are on the bottom, falls to the floor. Of course, in the last one, where it's hanging from a belt, there is no bottom. Everything just drips out the bottom. Okay. Now, just like we said before by Nikkur, Most of the labor that's done for this kind of work, the actual physical labor, putting on the salt and putting it into the water, out of the water, is done by people who are not Jewish, just plant employees. But there's a mashgiach overseeing it to make sure things are done correctly. Now, everything we said about Melichah is for just about all pieces of meat. But liver, the blood that's in the liver does not come out by salting. You need to do something else. You have to kasher, you have to be broiling it. That's like not for today's discussion, a little more complicated for anyone who's doing that. Okay, and last, before we go, is that after we did all this effort to make sure the meat is kosher, we did all these different steps to make sure we have it, the meat has to leave the plant with proper simanim on it, so that someone who buys it, a store or a consumer who buys it, knows that they're getting the kosher meat, rather than someone substituting, after all that work, substituting something treif in its place.